Hey guys, in today's video we're jumping to chapter 2 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, where we're going to start to talk about sense perception. Stay tuned. Alright, so let's dive right in with a summary of what Leonard Peikoff covers in the beginning of chapter 2. So chapter 2 overall is going to cover sense perception and volition. These are the foundations of epistemology. Epistemology is going to guide how we are supposed to use our minds. But in order to provide that kind of normative guidance, first we need to know two things. We need to know, one, that we have basic valid contact with reality, and we need to know that we have free will. Because if we don't have free will, then we don't need any guidance. And if we don't have control over how we use our minds at the conceptual level in order to keep it in contact with reality, then there's no use in offering that guidance. And so what we get in this section is the first, section is the first take on sense experience. And this section is called the senses as necessarily valid. And the starting point is that sense perception is axiomatic. That is, it is a corollary of consciousness, that in grasping that we are conscious, which we talked about in metaphysics, we grasp that the senses, our basic contact with reality, our basic form of awareness, that is valid. So why is it valid? It's valid because it is deterministic. It's a deterministic causal interaction between reality and our sensory apparatus. And so there's no choice involved, no possibility of delusion or error. There's just an automatic interaction between these things that produces awareness, and so there's no possibility of going wrong. The senses, you can think of it, are the awareness produced by the senses is the metaphysically given, not the man-made, not something that can depart from reality. Then we go into some of the traditional arguments against the senses and what's wrong with them, with a particular focus on a point that Ayn Rand stresses, which is the distinction between the object and form of awareness. That is, most of the traditional attacks on the senses blur this distinction, whereas what Ayn Rand insists on is that we are aware of objects in a certain form, and that is not a distortion of awareness. It doesn't interfere with our ability to be aware. It is the precondition of any awareness, and it doesn't lead to us reaching different conclusions at the conceptual level. The fact that different people can experience reality in a different form. And this is true whether we're talking about the difference between, a colorblind person and somebody who has regular colored sight, or whether we're talking about even different species or even a fantasy species that perceives reality in a completely different way. Leonard gives the example of an entity that would, I think a Martian, who would perceive atoms directly the way that we perceive tables, chairs, and computers. And his point that all sense experience, all sense perception is necessarily valid, that this isn't an issue of we just happen to have good luck. No, any sensory apparatus that gives people automatic awareness of reality gives them awareness, and that this doesn't lead to any differences at the conceptual level. And so what we have here is we have all senses as necessarily valid. Now, first thing we have to be clear on is what we're talking about when we talk about perception. That is, what is it that's given us by reality? And in particular, we need to distinguish from two things, between lower levels of awareness and higher levels of awareness, between sensations and then between various kinds of judgments. And I'm only going to say a word about sensations because we're going to cover this in detail in a future section. But the basic point is that some philosophers like Hume start with what we're aware of at the first level, the most basic level, is there's a patch of white, what we would call paper. There's a patch of white, and there's a flicker of noise when it's shaken. And there's all of these discrete sensations, and then the question is, how do we put them together into entities that are acting in a certain way? And what Objectivism says is no, that to the extent you can talk about sensations, that's not what we're given in awareness. Our primary contact with awareness is entities, is a world of entities spread out over space. That has to be distinguished, though, from judgments. So first of all, we can have conceptual judgments, right? You can have something like E equals MC squared, or capitalism is a moral system. And these obviously aren't things that we perceive. But even a conceptual judgment, like, you are looking, like, this is a computer in front of your face. The moment you're attaching a label to something, you're conceptualizing it, you're relating it to things, and that's not given in perception. It can seem like that because a lot of these first level concepts or low level concepts we automatize. And so in the very fact as an adult of looking at a car, or computer, or phone, you see them as members of a group, as units. That is not actually what's given in perception. What's given in perception is not a judgment. It's just a direct awareness of this phone. And even saying it's hard to talk about, right? Because it's what you see when you see a phone. It's the actual object that you see and you feel and you can hear and you can smell, or, God help you, taste your phone if you lick it. That it's just that raw, that raw experience, if you want to put it that way. But there's another category that we want to distinguish from, and that's not just conceptual judgments, but perceptual judgments. So, when you call something a phone, you're relating it to other phones, but sometimes you're just, like, if you say, hey, I see Cynthia. Well, that is a judgment, even though it's it's not a conceptual judgment. It's this person looks like Cynthia, but what's given you a perception is not this is Cynthia. It's just what you see when you see this person who may or may not be Cynthia, who looks like Cynthia. And so we need to separate out any of those kinds of judgments, any of those kinds of labels from perception, from our basic contact and reality. It's our basic contact with reality, what we get when we open our eyes and touch things with our hands and smell them and taste them and hear them. That's what is given to us. That is our inerrant form of awareness of reality. And judgments can err, whether we're talking about perceptual judgments or conceptual judgments. They have to be verified. They have to be validated by connecting them to what we get when we open our eyes. So Leonard stresses that the senses are axiomatic, and therefore they can't be proved. And I really like how Harry Binswanger's put this, where proof is second best. Proof is what you resort to when something isn't self-evident. Like, self-evident is the inerrant connection to reality. So it's not like an admission or something that we should make us go, oh, shucks, I don't have any proof for this. No, this is what we directly know. Any form of proof, and this is kind of the way that we know for sure that it's an axiom, counts on perception. Just the sheer fact of somebody saying, hey, can you prove this to me? What? I didn't hear you because I can't hear. How do I really know you said that? You cannot deny the validity of the senses without making use of them, without counting on them. So we know that this is axiomatic. And it's axiomatic as a corollary of consciousness. So remember, we talked in an earlier video that in order to grasp consciousness, what a child does when he grasps it implicitly is he grasps it through his senses. He grasps the distinction between my awareness, or at least my awareness through one particular mode of perception, such as seeing or hearing, can go away, but the object doesn't go away. That there's a distinction between my awareness and the existence of the objects of which I'm aware. So, I shut my eyes, but I can still hear my mom talking. I can plug my ears, but I can still see her mouth moving. I feel the rattle and I throw it to the ground. I can't feel it anymore, but I can still see it there. So it's through our senses that we grasp consciousness, we grasp awareness. And so it's another way of saying that what we grasp is, there is something of which I'm aware, is another way of saying, or it's the equivalent of saying, really, there is something of that I perceive. And as an aside, one of the things Leonard has pointed out is that this fact, the way that we grasp consciousness as fundamentally tied to our senses, to perception, this is the most foundational piece that leads Ayn Rand to, from the start, reject the mind-body dichotomy. how can you reject them? How can you hold a mind-body dichotomy when in the very fact of grasping consciousness, grasping the mind, grasping awareness, you grasp it as intimately or inextricably tied to a physical bodily process. It's not some free-floating thing of like, consciousness in what would you call it? Like in a void. It is tied to this physical process of perception. So the validity of the senses is an axiom. You can't deny it without affirming it. It is the given. It is self-evident. So what else is there to say in this point about like what do we need to know in order to really have a clear concept of the validation of the senses? And I think there's basically two views that you want to distinguish the objectivist view from. Two views that are in certain ways very plausible and good people fall into all the time when trying to defend the senses, but that are fundamentally wrong. And those are naive realism and representationalism. So naive realism, let's start with that. And this is basically the view that we perceive reality as it really is. That is, in effect, if you wiped human beings off the earth, you'd still have a world filled with color, filled with, the kind of tastes, smells, and textures that we perceive. It's the idea that we're aware of the object and that our awareness, that there's nothing contributed to that process by our means of awareness. That would be distorting. In effect, that reality is recreated in our mind exactly as it, quote, looks, even if human beings didn't exist. It's that the nature of our awareness is exhausted by the nature of the object. So what they would say is that if consciousness contributes anything, if color weren't really in the object, if color weren't if taste weren't really in the object, if our means of perception are impacting that experience, impacting that perception in any way, that's a distortion. And thankfully, they would say, no, that's not what happens. We perceive reality as it really is. All right, so naive realism implies that if we have different perceptions of something, then it has to be because of changes in the object. And there's really two attacks on this, and I think they're ultimately attacks that you can't answer from the perspective of naive realism. So one would be the problem of illusions. That is, we can perceive something in cases where the object doesn't change, but our perception changes. And the classic case here would be a stick that's straight and looks bent in water. And so the idea is we perceive a straight stick, we perceive a bent stick, and yet the object itself we know hasn't changed. Then there's a problem of the relativity of perception. And this is when we're perceiving the same object and but perceiving it differently. Or I perceive the object one way and you perceive the object a different way. And so you can think about the classic example here being, I have a hot hand and a cold hand and I put it in room temperature water, and this hand, the water feels warm, and this hand, the water feels cold. And the idea is, well, how can that be? If the water, is the water really cold or is the water really warm? It can't be a difference in the water. It's a difference that we're contributing. And so our senses are distorting things. And so we need to understand why naive realism can't answer this, and then what the actual right way to think about this is. Now, the basic answer to naive realism is that perceptual awareness is a process. It's a relationship. And like any relationship, it changes whenever there's a change in the object or in our means of awareness, in our process of awareness. And so if the object or the subject changes, there's going to be a change in awareness. But what Ayn Rand's big insight is that when the change is contributed by us, it's just a change in the form of awareness, but we're still aware of the object. It's the object in a different form. So what you could think of it is what changes is not the what, but the how, and that there's no distortion in this, that every perception has to be in a form. Every perception has to have a how. There is no such thing as perception, no how, or with no form. And so that's going to be really the key to coping with these kinds of arguments, that the naive realist view, which says, no, there can't be any contribution from the subject of awareness at all, is to come from the object, that they can answer and we can. So we take the stick and water type of case, and what naive realism, or what the attack is supposed to say, is that here the stick is bent and now the stick is straight, and so we have a contradiction. The senses are lying to us. And the point is that concluding that the stick is bent underwater is a judgment. That's not what senses give us. What the senses give us is that the stick looks bent in water, and when I take it out of the water, it looks straight. Or you could really boil down the overall experience this way, that what the senses tell us is that the stick that looks straight and feels straight, and we can do certain things with it on the basis of being straight, when I stick it underwater, I don't feel any pressure or anything that could be actually changing the stick. And in fact, I can stick my hand underwater and feel that it's still straight, and when I pull it back out, it's still straight. What our senses tell us, that's what our senses give us. And what conclusion that people actually do in fact draw here is not, wow, the stick is magically bent underwater, but yeah, the straight stick looks bent underwater. And so there's no real problem here, because what the senses are doing is giving us not just the isolated fact that, okay, this stick is straight, it has all the properties of being straight, and it should look that same way underwater. It's giving us a full context of all of the relevant facts, including facts we might not even be aware of, such as how light travels through water versus how it travels through air. And so from the objectivist point of view, a straight stick underwater looks bent. That's what a straight stick looks like. And so there's no special problem. That's not a distortion. It's not, it's not telling us anything wrong about reality, because again, the senses don't tell us anything. They just give us awareness. The senses, as Ayn Rand puts it, tell us that something exists. What exists is left to our mind, and our minds have no difficulty in grasping that, yeah, the stick is really straight. It's only the naive realist view that says, no, any change in awareness can only come from a change in the object of awareness. Now, it's the same thing with the relativity of the senses. Every version of it is basically just saying, it is just recognizing that what's changed is not the object, but the subject. The subject of awareness, something about those conditions has changed, but that what changed is just the form in which we're experiencing the object. So if you take the hands of different temperatures, what we actually get is that, let's say that the water is 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is what 70 degrees Fahrenheit water feels like if your hand is cold, and this is what it feels like if your hand is warm. Those are just our forms of experiencing water of a given temperature. And so there's no special problem here. There's no distortion. It's just a form of being aware of the object. And yes, there's a contribution from us, but that contribution isn't a distortion, and it doesn't lead us to errors, except we can make wrong judgments about those, but it's our senses that give us the means of correcting those judgments. So for example, we can use our senses to create certain kinds of instruments that allow us to measure in a much more precise way the temperature of the water, and we can see, oh no, yep, this water is definitely 70 degrees, and so it's not like it's some magical mixture of hot and cold. It's just that our means of being aware of it have changed. So the next view, and this will be the final issue that we cover, is another error, which is in rejecting naive realism, the alternative that people typically go for is representationalism. That is, we don't get reality straight. We don't have direct awareness of reality. We know that because of illusions. We know that because of the relativity of the senses. So what we're ultimately conscious of is a representation, a recreation of reality in our minds. We get impressions of reality. In effect, it's Harry Binswanger has put it as consciousness as self-consciousness. And schematically, the way you can think about it would be, that we don't perceive reality. What we perceive is a recreation of reality. There's a little guy in our mind watching, pictures on a screen, and that's what we're aware of. And the problem with this is that, well, okay, what's the relationship between that and reality? And you can't answer that. If you're cut off from reality at the level of the senses, then there's no way to establish any relationship between them. The only thing you can do is what Descartes did and basically say, well, God wouldn't be so mean as to trick us with lousy recreation, so they have to be accurate. But from Objectivism's perspective, what this really amounts to is saying, look, naive realists are wrong. We're aware of reality in a certain form, so what we're aware of is the form of awareness. It's that what representationalism is doing, in effect, is it's replacing the how with the what. It's saying that, whereas Objectivism would say, we are aware of reality somehow, they say what we're aware of is the how. And that is, it's a catastrophe, because it totally cuts you off from reality. This is the part I really want to underline. If I haven't done it enough, we're never aware of the form. We're aware of reality in a form. That is our connection to reality. And so you can't analogize awareness to, a little guy sitting in your head watching a screen. We're not aware of images. We're not aware of pictures on a screen. We're aware of objects. And in fact, people have pointed out that any form of representationalism counts implicitly, ultimately, in a form of presentationalism, of direct awareness. Because how is this guy who's watching images on a screen inside your head, how is he aware of the images on a screen? It can't just be that, well, there's a little man inside his head that's, watching images on a screen until you have an infinite regress. There has to be some form of direct awareness, and there is. Only the real direct awareness is in the first instant, you grasping objects in a certain form. And so Ayn Rand's going to really stress, we're going to go into this when we get to the identity of consciousness, is that that to be aware of reality, it has to be through a certain means, through a certain process, in a certain form. That's the precondition of awareness. It's not that which disqualifies us from having awareness. And so that representationalism is it's a non-solution to what ultimately is a non-problem. And so from Objectivism's view, awareness is not representational. It is direct awareness. It is, if you want to put it as presentational, it is when you open your eyes, you're not looking at your consciousness. You're not looking at pieces of your consciousness or impressions on your consciousness. No, you are conscious of the object, and that's all that there is to be said. So that's it for this video. What we've looked at is that to grasp the validity of the senses, we have to distinguish our primary contact with reality, which is perceptual, from sensations or any form of judgment. That what the senses give us, what perception gives us, is that something exists, and what exists has to be grasped by our mind. And we've seen that the right way to think about perception is that it's not naive realism, because we are aware in a certain form, and that form, when it changes, when the subject of perception changes, then our awareness of the object changes. But it's still our awareness of the object. It's not a distortion. It's not a violation, or it doesn't invalidate the senses. And we've seen that contra representationalism, it's not the form that we're aware of. It is the object in a form. And so that's going to give us the kind of foundation then to delve deeper into other issues in perception. And so we will do that in the next video. In the meantime, if you like this one, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already. And as always, the best way to stay in contact is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk soon.